Well, it's 6:02. I'm going to call the meeting to order and perhaps and hopefully we'll have a few more panelists come in, or at least one more, just so that we can meet quorum. But in the meantime, hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special meeting of the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. My name is Emily Davis. I always forget to introduce myself. My name is Emily Davis, and I am currently serving as chair through December of this year. And I said that this was a special meeting of NDCAP, and the reason why is that this is special is because it's outside of the panel's typical business of going through and receiving state reports on the decommissioning progress and process, and also hearing reports from Northstar, again, of the decommissioning of the Vermont Yankee plant. Tonight, the panel will be discussing a draft advisory opinion, which is to be considered as comments to the Department of Energy's request for information on using a consent-based siting process to identify federal interim nuclear waste storage facilities. And that's a mouthful, but it is the focus of this evening's meeting. So we're going to unpack what that is. So again, tonight, the panel as a whole is going to deliberate on the language that was drafted by a smaller committee of the panel. The committee is the Federal Nuclear Waste Policy Committee. And they have been working in a year-long process led by Lisa Weinman. That committee spent the last year learning and studying the different facets of the nuclear waste issue. And then in early December, when the Department of Energy released its RFI, we thought that this was perhaps a timely opportunity for the committee to develop some draft language for the panel to consider based on its learning of the past year. And as a reminder, the panel decided on this date, February 28th, for this special meeting because the RFI is due on March 4th, which is Friday. Is that Friday? Which is Friday. Yes. And so if this panel were to decide to approve language, it could submit it by that deadline. So just as a quick programming note, members of this current panel have not yet taken on an advisory opinion process together. So not only is this a special meeting because the business is very different, but what we're doing here tonight is also very new. So I'm just going to thank everybody, all the panelists and member of the public and everyone who's here in advance for sticking with good process and thoughtful conversation and deliberation. And I appreciate patience and commitment and civility as we navigate this new kind of conversation. And to make sure that the panel does have time to deliberate on the language of the advisory opinion itself, I ask that we make wise use of our time with our presenters who are graciously here spending their evening with us, and use them as subject matter experts so that we can dive into some of the draft language in the advisory opinion. So at this point, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the meeting agenda. This meeting has three main parts. First, we're joined by the Department of Energy, and Dr. Kim Petrie is here with her team, and they'll be presenting on the current RFI and the DOE's consent-based siting initiative. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Thomas Webler about some very recent research relating to and around the consent-based siting process, its challenges and opportunities. There will be, those presentations will be about 15 minutes, and then there will be a question and answer period following each of those presentations. So you can hold your questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll have some time after each to discuss and for you to ask any questions of the presenters. And then after that, the panel will then turn to the committee's work. We'll look at the advisory opinion language. And by this point, too, I'll say that panelists have had a time to review the advisory opinion. Hopefully, panelists have spent some time with it. And so if there are any proposed changes based on the information that we heard from our presenters, we'll be able to propose that draft language. And I'll turn to Alyssa here, too, to kind of comment on the committee's process and then other panelists that were part of that committee. Any amendments to the meeting agenda before we hop in with introductions? Before we go in? Okay. And how are we with quorum? I wasn't monitoring the incoming folks.
We've had Sarah Coffey and Chris Campany join. So by my count, we have 10 panelists.
Wonderful. Present. Welcome, Sarah and Chris. And just in time, before we move into the U.S. Department of Energy's presentation, we'll do a panel roll call just to confirm that quorum. So I'll just go right down the list and say your names, and then panelists, if you could introduce yourself so members of the public and also our presenters can know who you are. So we'll start at the top with Madeline Arms.
Good afternoon, good evening, Madeline Arms, Town of Vernon.
Todd Amato.
Good evening, Todd Amato from the Town of Vernon.
Hi, Todd. I'm also going to pause here and just officially welcome Todd to the panelist. We have our second representative from the Town of Vernon, and Todd, we're very gracious that you can serve on NDCAP with us, so welcome. Chris Campany.
Here, Chris Campany, Wyndham Regional Commission. I'm an executive director. We have a seat on the panel.
Hi, Chris. Representative Sarah Coffey.
Hi, good evening. I'm Sarah Coffey. I'm a citizen appointee by the Speaker of the House, and I live in Guilford.
And you have and your cat's name?
Our cat, and he really likes Zoom meetings, so yeah.
Patricia Coppolino is not here this evening. Corey Daniels.
Good evening, Corey Daniels, North Star representative. I'm the spent fuel storage installation manager at North Star Vermont and Cape.
Hi, Corey. Emily Davis, myself. Bill Irwin, I believe, is not able to be here this evening. Bob Leach is also not available. Brett Long.
Hi, this is Brett Long. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Vermont Department of Economic Development.
Good evening, Brett. Senator Mark McDonald. Also not here. David Pearson.
Good evening, David Pearson, North Star representative, vice president of North Star.
Hi, David.
Hello.
Marvin Resnikoff. Representative Laura Sibilia is on the panel, but she can't make it this evening. Typically, as an ex officio seat, we have Commissioner June Tierney, but I think Jim Porter, you're here as Commissioner's designee this evening.
Yes.
Thank you.
On behalf of the department, absolutely.
Thank you so much and welcome. Josh Unruh, I think is not available this evening. And then Lissa Weinman.
Lissa Weinman, I'm a citizen appointee appointed by State Senator Becca Ballant.
Wonderful. Welcome, Lissa. Okay, great, panelists. That confirms our quorum. So then we can move on with this evening's business. So hopping right into the first item on the agenda, which is the U.S. Department of Energy presentation on consent-based siting. So here I'll turn to Dr. Kim Petrie, as in the dish. So Dr. Kim Petrie is the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Spent Fuel and Waste Disposition for the U.S. Department of Energy. Dr. Petrie is also joined by Dr. Erica Bickford, who is the Transportation Program Manager, Ms. Natalia Sareva, who is the Senior Advisor on Consent-Based Siting, and Mr. Rob Howard, who is the National Technical Director for Integrated Waste Management Program for the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So I understand that you have a presentation for us, which has been posted to the NDCAP website for folks who want to download it and follow along yourself. And I believe, Dr. Petrie, you'll be sharing your screen. Is that right?
I think Natalia will be.
Okay.
Yep. She's working on it.
Okay, great. And the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Okay. All right. So
You can go to the first slide, Natalia.
Okay.
So nuclear energy is essential to tackling climate change. It currently provides 20% of our nation's electricity and half of our clean emissions-free energy. And we absolutely need nuclear to achieve 100% clean electricity sector and net zero emissions by 2050. And so as we continue to deploy nuclear energy as a solution for decarbonization, increasing access to energy and tackling climate change, we need to make progress on the management of spent nuclear fuel. Inaction on this issue has already cost the taxpayers nearly $9 billion in settlements and judgments. And while the spent nuclear fuel is stored safely all across the United States, the communities that have the spent nuclear fuel, including yours, never agreed to host the material long term. So it is our responsibility to those communities like yours to move the spent nuclear fuel to an interim storage facility, and the time to start work on that is now. We cannot continue to defer this problem for future generations to figure out. Management of this fuel and high-level radioactive waste is the Department of Energy's responsibility. And we are working to develop a comprehensive integrated waste management plan that will address spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. An integrated waste management system will include consolidated interim storage capacity, a permanent disposal pathway, and the transportation infrastructure needed to move spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste. In order to sustainably and responsibly manage the spent nuclear fuel, we will need to site both the interim storage and permanent disposal facilities. And we need to identify willing, informed host communities to be our partners in this mission. Next slide. Right now, we are specifically focused on interim storage. In the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, Congress provided the department funds to move forward on establishing a federal interim storage capability. With the final FY21 appropriation, DOE can now pursue activities related to the process for identifying an interim storage site. Interim storage will allow for the removal of spent nuclear fuel from reactor sites, promote new jobs and economic opportunities for host communities, and begin reducing liability to taxpayers. It will also provide useful research opportunities and build trust and confidence with stakeholders and the public by demonstrating a new approach to siting. Next slide, please. The department is committed to a consent-based siting approach that enables broad participation and centers equity and environmental justice. Consent-based siting makes the needs of the people and communities central to the siting process. Communities can elect to participate by and working collaboratively through a series of steps and phases with the department as the implementing organization. Each step and phase helps the community determine whether and how hosting an interim storage facility is aligned with the community's goals. By its nature, a consent-based siting process must be flexible, adaptive, and responsive to community concerns. The phases and steps are intended to serve as a guide, not a prescriptive set of instructions. And consent-based siting will look different in each individual community. So by working through the consent-based siting process collaboratively, we hope to build trust and a beneficial working relationship between the department and the potential host community. Possible outcomes from the consent-based siting process could include a negotiated consent agreement defined by the community in collaboration with the department, or a determination that after exploring the option, the community is simply not interested. We consider both to be successful outcomes. We understand this is a daunting challenge, but we believe the consent-based approach is both the right thing to do and our best chance for success. Next slide. In December, we took a first step towards making progress on meeting that responsibility. Hopefully, many of you saw the department issued a request for information, an RFI, using a consent-based siting process to identify sites to store the nation's spent nuclear fuel. We published the RFI in the Federal Register, and as it's been mentioned, it's open until Friday, March 4th. Next slide. We are not yet seeking communities to volunteer to host sites. Rather, we are interested in hearing from the public on a range of topics. The consent-based siting process itself, removing barriers to meaningful participation, especially for groups and communities who have not historically been well represented in these conversations. And lastly, interim storage as a component of the nation's waste management system. We have a special focus on ensuring issues of equity and environmental justice are built into the consent-based siting approach, as well as the waste management system as a whole. And we plan to use the feedback we received from the RFI to develop a federal interim storage program that uses a consent-based siting process to work with low and host communities. While this RFI is specifically focused on interim storage facilities for spent nuclear fuel, we expect what we learn we can apply to siting permanent disposal facilities in the future and potentially siting efforts for other technology or other place-based initiatives. So I want to take a moment to emphasize that we take the feedback we are receiving and that we will still receive through the RFI really seriously. Some of our next steps will depend on what we hear back from through the RFI. For example, the responses will inform the further development of the draft consent-based siting process and the overall integrated waste management strategy. Also, we hope that responses will inform the ways we will be engaging with communities through the process, including, for example, types of information and resources that need to be available to minimize barriers for participation and allow for equitable and a just process. So while some of you may have engaged on consent-based siting in the past, and we are certainly taking the input we've already received into consideration, I sincerely hope that you will consider responding to the RFI, and it sounds like that you all will be. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're using feedback from the RFI to inform some of our next steps. In the near term, we're hard at work analyzing the responses we've already received to the RFI. We're further developing our draft consent-based siting process from 2017. We're clarifying our broader strategy for an integrated waste management system, and we're preparing to issue a funding opportunity for interested groups and communities later this year. So as we work towards progress on this issue, we hope you'll continue to engage with us and allow us to benefit from your expertise and perspective as a community currently hosting a decommissioning nuclear plant. By prioritizing communities and people, we believe we can find a solution to the decades-long stalemate on managing the nation's spent nuclear fuel and keep driving towards the clean energy future that we all need. Thank you. And are there any questions? I think we're supposed to move on to Q&A now. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Petrie. At this point, we can turn to questions or comments from the panel and the public. And just as we enter into this question and comment period, just a bit of tech housekeeping. If you'd like to be officially acknowledged, you can raise your hand through Zoom, the little blue hand. I can't see all the videos, so raising the little blue hand is sure to get attention. And you can type questions into the chat, but it is not guaranteed because not is being independently monitored. So it's not guaranteed that chat questions will get answered. So feel free to raise your hand and I will call on you. So any questions or comments for Dr. Petrie and the rest of the DOE team? Yes, Chris.
Hi, thanks for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. Glad to hear that you are making use of the comments from the prior effort. The comments I submitted on behalf of the Windham Regional Commission are actually the same that we submitted then. But one thing I just want to bring up, a couple of concepts that we had raised before, is to ensure inclusiveness, the idea that the feds create basically performance measures for local siting decisions or arriving at a consent at consent, I guess would be the word, that rather than dictate a specific public engagement process for all nuclear waste host communities, the federal government instead consider defining performance measures that would establish community outreach, inclusion, and transparent decision-making outcomes, with an emphasis on the identification of environmental and socioeconomic justice concerns from the outset. And the reason for that, sometimes I know federal processes rely on other plans and zoning and that kind of thing, which is good. But if those communities didn't engage in a fully inclusive process, and if they didn't reach that decision in a way that benefits the most impacted communities, then you're dealing with some of the same structural issues that deal with other, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic discrimination. So just wanted to throw that out there. The other thing too that I've been advocating for a while is really creating a consortium of host communities with potential receiving communities, because it's can be difficult to make the case for why a community should receive the waste if sending communities are desperate to get rid of it. So having that kind of forum, an actual public forum, where you intentionally bring folk together, communities that are considering receiving the waste, along with communities that would be sending the waste, so that there's some mutual understanding and agreement about what the benefits should be for, especially the community taking the waste, would encourage that. And I really, in a perfect world, wish that the DOE, NRC, EPA, and others could work better together just to develop a more comprehensive nuclear policy for the country, because this kind of bifurcation of responsibilities I don't think is particularly helpful or healthy. So, but really, really appreciate your being here, and thanks for making the time.
Thank you for those comments. I would like to just respond to one thing that you said, because we're in complete agreement with the fact that we want this process to be inclusive and not dictate terms. That is the opposite of what we want to do. Well, I think the federal government has tried that in the past and it didn't really work very well. So we're trying the process that has worked well for other countries, and we're going to adapt it based on the information we get back from the RFI, from the former comments and the comments that we get this time around. So I appreciate those comments. It means a lot to know that we're all thinking in the same line of thought here. Great, thank you.
Unless there are any other responses to Chris's comment, then we'll turn to Dr. Thomas Webler.
I have one question.
Is this in addition to what was just said, or a response to that, Lissa?
No, it's in addition, just.
Oh, sure, quickly, and then we'll turn to Dr. Webler.
Yeah, just a question regarding the funding opportunity that you talked about. Can you specify that? Does that mean that because there was nobody that stepped forward in the last consent-based process, that you're trying to put out a financial incentive ahead of time to see who bites? I mean, part of our group's language that we've put forth, we talk about the need to really identify appropriate places before putting out a general call to the nation. I mean, obviously, not just any community could take on this responsibility. So I'm just curious how that's foreseen to work.
Sure, excellent question. And part of the answer we don't know yet, because we're waiting for responses to the RFI, which actually are requesting from stakeholders what they think the department needs to be doing in this arena. The intention of the FOA is not to find willing host communities right out of the gate. It is really to share information, to allow communities the opportunity to learn more about the consent-based siting process, what it might mean. This first phase that we're working towards won't be to really have communities volunteer. It's really an opportunity for communities to learn more about what it might mean to host an interim storage facility. But
Kim, can I just
yeah, go ahead.
jump on and clarify just for Lisa? So Lisa, well, the department did have a consent-based siting initiative from 2015 to 2017. It didn't end because we didn't get any volunteers. It was really in its early, in its very early phases, and then we had an administration change, and the incoming administration decided to discontinue the program. So then we had sort of no activity for a period of years. Now we have a new administration again that has directed us to resume that effort. So it's more of, we started in 2015 to 2017, paused for several years, and now we're picking it back up again. So it's still kind of a continuation of that process that was started earlier.
And to add to what Erica said, in 2017, we released the draft consent-based siting process for comments, for public comments. So it was not a call for any volunteers at that time.
Thank you.
Emily, can I just jump in for just 1 second? This is Marvin.
If it's a clarifying question, we do have a little queue, and I want to acknowledge the folks that do have their hands raised, Marvin.
Yes.
But if it's a clarifying question, then go ahead.
My question is the Department of Energy require any new federal legislation to go forward with this program?
Excellent question. So the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, as it's currently written, allows us to do several activities up until the point where we would actually start building something. And that would require a change to the existing law. But the way that's going to take a while. And we're going to be diligently working in the meantime to work with Congress on revising the Nuclear Waste Policy Act so that we can in fact move forward when the time comes to actually construct something. But we believe we have the authority to do all kinds of activities up until actually starting construction.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Webler, go ahead.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Dr. Petrie, for being here. It's great that you're taking the time. I think the RFI is a great idea. I'll be submitting comments as soon as we can get them together, last minute, of course, even though we've known about it for a long time. But I was really wanted to, Chris Campany kind of asked my question already, but I want to ask it again in a maybe a slightly different way, maybe not as well as he asked us, but what will you produce at the end of this RFI? I mean, Chris said performance metrics, or is it going to be a blueprint for a process? Is it going to be a set of guidelines for the agencies to follow? What do you anticipate?
Okay, good question. So there's several products that we hope to create with the comments that we received back from the RFI. One is the department's strategy for moving forward with an integrated waste management program. So essentially, what do we need to do in order to have a good program that can survive through politics and navigate the tumultuous process that we currently have, and actually make progress on siting interim storage facility or repository. And a lot of that is dependent upon what money Congress appropriates to us. And right now they've appropriated funds just for interim storage. We're also revising the draft consent-based siting process. We want to make it a final process. And before we do that, we wanted to have one last opportunity for everyone to weigh in before we finalize that document. And then the last thing is the funding opportunity announcement. We're using the comments from the RFI to help us figure out the best way to write that and draft it and solicit feedback or to just dispense the funds for that activity. Erica, Natalia, Rob, did I miss anything that you want to jump in there?
I'll just add, it also will depend on what type of responses we'll get to the RFI, because they are informing our products. So we do encourage you all to please send us the comments. I know the panel will be preparing a response, and we're really grateful for that. The conversation doesn't end with the RFI; it will continue. And as Dr. Petrie mentioned, we hope to get the solid process as a result. However, it's adaptive and flexible approach, so it will be revised as needed.
Okay, then we'll turn to Deb Katz. Good evening, Deb.
Good evening. Hi. So thank you for coming. I have some concerns and I guess some questions. One is, when the Blue Ribbon Commission met and it advocated, in fact, for the issue of dealing with consent, it wanted the process not to be done by the DOE, that agency, but in fact to be independent, because they didn't want an agency that had a dog in the fight. I mean, it's clear from the way you began that you advocate for nuclear power. The issue of having an independent, unbiased, not agency necessarily, but a process is really important in terms of being able to have a positive effect in this, because many communities feel that they're really being manipulated and targeted in this process, and that this is more for show than actually doing anything. The communities that have been affected by nuclear power are basically working poor, people of color, and Native American communities. And they have been, in fact, the target for high-level waste in this country in terms of Yucca Mountain, in terms of the Mescalero, Apache, where there was an attempt to do independent interim storage there, also the Skull Valley Goshute Reservation in Utah. So there is great distrust among groups as well as communities in terms of the issue of bias in this. There is also the issue to me in terms of when you're talking about a community, but who really gives consent? Are we talking about a community? Are we talking about a county? Are we talking about a state? Are we talking, it's more than just a community in this, because there are many processes of consent, and who is allowed to give consent, and how long does that process go on? Like, it's a date, right? And you don't kiss on the first date and you get to say no, but how long do you still get to say no? Until the very end or not? And then the other concern I have in this, it's like putting the cart before the horse. You're talking about a consent-based process when in fact the NRC and the DOE, for that matter, and the industry have abdicated their responsibility to, in fact, engage in a process to find a deep geological burial site in which science is the driving force, not the choice of community, which in fact has become the driving force, just as it was with the Screw Nevada bill, which chose Yucca Mountain because Nevada was a poor and vulnerable state. And so there is great distrust in communities across the country at this point. And in a sense, the way you're presenting going about this, I'm concerned doesn't relieve the distrust for communities that have had to deal with this. I live 4 miles from one reactor and 16 miles from another. I basically am between 2 high-level waste dumps. But I can't accept that the waste that hurt my community can just be fobbed off on someone else and hurt them. So thank you.
If I may, just before we go to the department's response, Deb, could you please introduce yourself just so so the panelists, I forgot to mention, just so that panelists can know who among members of the public who you are and where you're from.
You're right. So I'm Deb Katz. I'm the executive director of the Citizens Awareness Network. We are a grassroots group in New England. We have about 1,500 members or more, and we are really concerned with the issues of nuclear pollution, which my community suffered, and we don't want other communities to suffer as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And I want to start off by saying I couldn't agree with you more. Having our office manage this process is probably not the best choice. It is the choice that we've been given at the current moment. The vision is something more like a TVA-like authority, which is separate from the Office of Nuclear Energy. If you are aware of the history, there was a separate office outside of the Office of Nuclear Energy called the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management, and we're aware that this is something that needs to be addressed, and there have been some internal discussions on it. We have a lot of stakeholders internally that we're working with to try and figure out what makes the most sense. If you followed what happened in Canada, the NWMO, their group that's working on the same issue, is much more independent from their government, and that seems to work better. And so we recognize that something probably needs to happen, but we haven't gotten far enough to figure out how or what that is yet. But it is on our radar, and we understand, and it is on our radar. The question of consent, yes, that's an excellent question. I was just talking with someone earlier about that. Whether it's at the community, state, or county level, it will. The way that we're currently looking at it is that it will be different in every community, in every state, in every county. And part of what we hope to get back from the RFI will help inform what the meaning of consent is. Its breadth and depth, because it might not be the same in one state or one community, where it might be something different somewhere else. And you'll note that I did mention in my my talking points that a permanent repository is absolutely required at some point. At this juncture, the department only has authority to move forward on an storage facility, but we are working with our congressional colleagues to come up with a path forward on that, because we realize that we need both. And we are going to work very hard to rebuild trust. It's been 70 years since we started down this path, and while we're not starting from step zero, we still haven't built anything. So we're really hopeful this time around, because other countries have been very successful with this kind of process. So instead of dictating what would happen, we're asking what people want. So
Thank you.
So next we'll turn to Deborah Stolaroff. Good evening, Deborah. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yes, hi, and sorry, I'm not putting on my video. My internet is unstable. I'm hoping that I won't freeze in the middle of of my questioning. I'm a member of the Vermont Yankee Decommissioning Alliance. The Vermont Yankee Decommissioning Alliance spent 40 years working to shut down Vermont Yankee, and we are now focused on the safe decommissioning of the plant, as well as the addressing the storage issues, making sure that it's an environmentally just process, and that it's safely stored. The high level waste is safely stored. Deb got to some of my questions, but I still wanted to ask some clarifying questions. You mentioned that the DOE was, that this RFI is looking for communities to volunteer. So I wondered if those communities that have been identified prior to this moment, if those communities are no longer being considered, and if they no longer need to be worrying about whether they consent or not to this process. And then also, what happens if no communities volunteer? If you get no RFIs, no communities who are interested in hosting an interim storage facility, what will the DOE do next?
Okay, so we're not asking for volunteers at this point. And if someone has expressed interest, we are absolutely willing to have conversations with them. But we are following this very deliberate process that we are having the public be a huge part of. So no decisions have been made. There is no there's just no decisions have been made at this point. We're just starting the process to interact with communities. We're not asking for volunteers at this point. And
right. Oh, sorry. I do understand that. As the process continues, and these communities that have already been identified, for example, the communities in New Mexico and that are bordering on Texas.
You're talking about the private interim storage facilities?
Yeah, those communities that have already been identified.
Oh, okay.
If they no longer consent, if they don't consent, and as far as I know, they don't consent, will they then be taken off this list? Or if there is a list? I don't know if there's a list. I apologize for my ignorance around this.
No. I misunderstood your question. I understand what you're saying now. The private initiatives, they don't have anything to do with the department's process, what we're doing. The congressional appropriation that the department received is for a federal interim storage facility that follows the consent-based siting process. The private initiative started before we've started our process. So they're welcome to become part of the process, but they are not federal facilities. They're owned by private companies. So there's not much I can say about them because we're not far along enough in our process to even have them interact with us. They're welcome to respond to our RFI. That's essentially where we are with that. Because as you stated, they haven't followed our consent-based setting process because it's still in draft form.
Okay. All right. So then, if there are no communities that consent to this process at all, what would the DOE do then?
Well, that's years down the road, I would imagine. And as I mentioned, and I think Natalia mentioned as well, we're hoping that our goal is to make this process iterative, flexible, and adaptable. So if we're finding that there is an interest, then maybe we change the process in some way. I can't predict what we're going to be doing in a few years, but for now, I mean, we are considering for our funding opportunity, if we go out and communities say they're not interested, we consider that a success because we've engaged with communities and they told us what they wanted and we listened. So that's where we're starting from. Projecting too far into the future, we're going to be as flexible and adaptive as we possibly can, given the fact that we're the federal government.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Tina Olson. Tina, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi. This is my partner's website. I'm Skylar Gould. I'm on the board of Citizens Awareness Network. I'm also a past president of New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution, which was a recognized stakeholder in front of the Public Utilities Commission during the sale of Vermont Yankee by Entergy to North Star. Erica, thanks for coming back. I remember our meeting back in July, I think, before the committee. You mentioned at that time that DOE is developing a consent-based siting website. How is that effort progressing? You said it should be up and running by the end of last summer.
Yes. Hi, good to see you again. Just for everybody, for those who joined late, my name is Erica Bickford. I work for Kim Petrie at the Department of Energy. I focus on planning for future large-scale transportation of spent nuclear fuel, and I did speak to the subcommittee was it last summer or last fall, somewhere around then. So the consent-based siting website is up and running. It took a little bit longer than we had initially hoped. It's on the last slide that Kim showed, but it's energy.gov/consent-based siting, all one word. And Natalia just put it in the chat. Thanks for that, Natalia. So that has the basic information, including a link to the RFI. It has the comments that we received back in the 2017 time period on the draft consent-based siting process, as well as links to the draft consent-based siting process. And I believe what we heard when we went out in 2015 and 2016 and did public meetings. So we have big plans to build that out and have more technical and information resources on that website in the future, but we certainly welcome your feedback on resources or information that you'd like to see on that website as well.
Also, if I can ask Erica, you speculated last time that legal analysis raised some uncertainty whether or not there is any legal mechanism by which DOE would even be able to engage with a private facility on any issues. Has that possibility of legal uncertainty relationship between DOE and private facilities, has that been explored any further? Is it possible that DOE would farm out some of its responsibilities to a private facility, specifically storing the waste at a CISF without going through the consent? And that raises my other question, which is repeated again and again. Do these private facilities get a pass on this whole elaborate process, which the government seems to be important regarding consent-based siting? Are they not at all liable to follow such guidelines?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this, and Kim and Natalia, feel free to jump in. Yeah, so as Kim mentioned, those private, interim storage facilities were initiated several years ago by private companies. I believe at various points in time, their model was to contract with the Department for Services. Our internal advisors have indicated that it's unclear whether DOE would even have the authority to do that. But separate from that, in the in the congressional authorization that we have that was in the consolidated budget appropriations of fiscal year 21, Congress specifically gave the department funds and directed the department to pursue a federal interim storage facility. So those private facilities are not federal facilities. And also to cite federal interim storage facilities using a consent-based citing process, which, as we've discussed, neither of those facilities followed a consent-based citing process as DOE is defining it or outlining it. So the current status is that those private companies are doing their own thing, independent, and DOE is focused on consent-based citing for one or more federal interim storage facilities. So it's two separate activities.
Is it logical to think, although one facility has been given a license by the NRC, Independent Storage Partners, that NRC would be required to require a consent-based citing process of a private facility as a part of its licensing process?
I can't speak for what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission should or shouldn't do. I got to stay in my Department of Energy lane.
Yeah, and just if I can ask you again, and I don't want to interrupt any of your cohorts' comments on that, but since your bailiwick is transportation, obviously DOE is contemplating a multi-billion-dollar enterprise here to moving the waste, and how could a private facility possibly entertain that kind of investment? And is it in fact true that is there any possibility, because I've talked to people in the industry who their business model includes DOE providing the transportation for their waste to be transported from one private facility to another private facility. Is that not true? Not a possibility, never going to happen? I see Kimberly shaking her head.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, never going to happen, who knows? But I will say that DOE has no current mechanism to move spent nuclear fuel from utility sites to private interim storage facilities.
Okay.
Under the existing Nuclear Waste Policy Act law, DOE, the model is that DOE goes to nuclear power plants, takes title and control of the spent nuclear fuel, which releases the utilities from the title and control. And so they're no longer responsible for it. And DOE takes it to a federal facility. Any other model than that is really, raises a lot of questions that I can't answer. And that's not what we're planning to do. As we've stated, we're planning on citing one or more federal interim storage facilities, which would follow the sort of planned model as laid out in the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, where DOE picks up the fuel and brings it to a federal facility and manages it from there forward.
Do you think it's realistic that a private facility can actually, licensed or not, can actually receive high-level nuclear waste for interim storage?
I mean, I think logistically, I'm sure. I don't know. I can't speak to the economics of how that would work. I'm I'm a scientist. I'm not a business major. So clearly somebody believes that it's a worthwhile endeavor, but I mean, you raise good questions on, what that economic model looks like.
Thank you.
So I'll acknowledge Anne Darling. Good evening, Anne. If you can introduce yourself, and then I don't see any other hands raised. So Anne, we'll stick with you, and then we'll stay with the timing of the agenda, and then switch to Dr. Webler's presentation. But Anne, go ahead.
Great. Hi, thank you, DOE, for coming to visit with us. I'm Anne Darling. I live in East Hampton, down the river from Vermont Yankee, and kind of in the smack dab in the middle of 5 nuclear power plants, decommissioned or decommissioning. So I'm also a member of the Citizens Awareness Network, as several of us are here tonight. You stated that I want to go back to something Skylar was talking about in terms of the NRC and these private facilities. And I think that you can't see these as really distinct because the NRC doesn't have to follow the rules that you're trying to create. They can license a private facility and without consent. They sued the state of Vermont when we tried to say, we want this plant to shut down. We do not want to extend the license. And they sued and successfully won on the basis that the state was trying to talk about safety. And there is a federal preemption on safety when it comes to nuclear power. So you right there, when the NRC gets involved, consent goes out the window, in my opinion. So this comes back to the question of how this is actually going to work. DOE, NRC, a separate entity. I also just want to say that, when you say that you feel nuclear energy is essential to addressing climate change, I don't agree with you at all. It's going to take too long to, it's just, and it's too dirty. It pollutes, but the communities that are hosting waste never agreed to have hosting it there long term. And that's true. We thought that the federal government was going to, take care of it, and the industry. So, but the next statement you made was it needs to be moved away from these communities. And that's your position, but there's folks that would not necessarily agree with that because, and I have not seen DOE or anyone really seriously look at hardening it on site versus the risks and the cost of moving it twice. Moving the waste, let's say, to a federal interim storage and then moving it back, moving it to a long-term storage facility. I don't think you're going to build the trust and confidence of stakeholders by moving it necessarily. I really don't. You definitely have to have a lot of history to get over there. So I think it's great to talk about consent-based siting, but the problems run very, very deep. And I'm happy you're here to listen to us. I'm a little skeptical. I also wonder if you, maybe this is a question for Erica. I don't know, but when you take all this waste, it's high-level waste through communities, trucks, railroads, barges, whatever, are you going to get the consent of those communities? All kinds of stuff comes from my community that I have no idea about it, and I don't see any precedent for that, but I think it's important.
Thank you for your comments. I will defer to Erica on your last transportation comment because we've gotten that question before. And I believe, Erica, that the answer that we've been given is there are federal agencies outside of DOE that regulate what can and can't go from point A to point B in the United States. It's kind of like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They have their lane. And DOT, the Department of Transportation, has theirs. So there's and then we have ours. And while we all coordinate, we all follow a specific set of laws that we're required to follow. So Erica, do you have anything?
I hope you really coordinate well.
Yeah, Kim, do you want me to jump in on that now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so thank you for the question, Anne. In answer to your question about consent for transportation, there is not consent for transportation the same way that we envision consent for siting a long-term facility. However, there are many avenues existing in the regulations for states, tribes, and local governments to have input or participate in the planning and execution of that transport. So in just the U.S. Department of Transportation regulations, things like if you're moving any hazardous material, including spent nuclear fuel by highway, states and tribes have the ability to designate preferred routes, so determine where those shipments can and can't go. If you're moving on local roads, so for example, in Vermont Yankee, you have direct rail line, which is great. For sites that don't have direct rail, say Yankee Row, and you have to do heavy haul truck to rail situation, you need permits. You need local permits to do those movements. So that's another avenue where local communities have a say. And then for rail transportation, there are federal regulations that govern how you route shipments of certain hazardous materials, including spent nuclear fuel. There was a relatively recent regulation that was enacted back in 2008 that requires the rail carriers to consider 27 different factors in evaluating the safety and security risks of transporting that material. And one of the factors that they have to account for is seeking input from states and tribes on the risks, on the infrastructure, the rail infrastructure through their jurisdictions. So those are some ways just in the existing regulatory framework. In addition, for DOE's plans for large-scale transport of spent nuclear fuel that we expect to be primarily by rail due to the size and weight of the containers, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act requires that the department provide technical assistance and training to public safety officials. So what we would model based on other DOE radioactive material shipping campaigns is an extensive public engagements, doing road shows, doing demonstration runs, working closely with states, tribes, and local communities to provide the information that they need, to provide resources for training, and communication to their constituents as well. So that's the model that DOE has built on. And I won't say that it didn't come fully baked. It's over decades of experience of maybe not doing things the best way every time. We certainly have now a good library of lessons learned and best practices that we can implement now as we plan for moving fuel from nuclear power plant sites. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're a couple minutes over schedule, but not too bad. Panel, now we'll turn to a presentation from Dr. Webler. And before we do, thank you so much to our friends from the Department of Energy for joining us tonight. I understand that you can stick around a little bit more. So if there are remaining questions as the panel discusses the language of the advisory opinion, you'll be around. That would be very gracious. Thank you so much. Okay, so Dr. Webler, thank you for being patient. I'd like to introduce you if I can. Dr. Webler is an associate professor of environmental studies at Keene State College. He also serves on the board of directors at the Social and Environmental Research Institute. His research and past scholarship and current scholarship focuses on collaborative and democratic problem solving in the context of energy, sustainability, and climate change. So Dr. Webler, you're here to share some of your most recent research and work on consent-based siting and its challenges and opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. I recently retired, so not at Keene State anymore. Well, I'm still teaching there, but mostly just working at SERI now. Just, had kind of a history with this stuff. My thing's always been public participation since my graduate student days. And I guess the work with DOE stuff started with the site-specific advisory boards at the nuclear weapons sites, where we looked at how they were engaging with communities. We also testified, I'm talking about myself and Seth Tuller mainly. We also have testified to the Blue Ribbon Commission back in 2010. As far as this panel, the NDCAP, we were engaged in an early project way back to think about the design of this panel and how communities could be involved in decommissioning projects in general. After this that was some 10 or so years ago. And then in 2016, 17, we were interviewing some of you about the design of the process, and people at Indian Point and San Onofre and other sites, Kewanee and so on, about the best way to design a citizens panel for decommissioning. And then we got into, we had a contract with the Department of Energy to think about the origins of this idea of consent. What are the academic backgrounds of this? And then we have this little project, which has no funding at all. So we're just doing this on our own. And we were curious. We know that there's been a lot of conversations about what consent-based citing can look like or should look like. And Deb and other people have already raised a bunch of these issues. So we thought we'd go out and ask some people, you guys know all this, what do we mean? Some sort of idea of a community voluntarily agreeing to host a facility in their political jurisdiction. Why do we use this word consent instead of acceptance or social license to operate? There's a whole history of this. You'll find people on different sides of it, but we have argued that consent has a really strong academic and long history, goes all the way back in medical ethics to antiquity, research ethics since World War II, with the onset of how researchers have to treat other people and get consent, large infrastructure projects in which the UN has set guidelines for free, prior, informed consent, mainly from indigenous peoples who could be impacted by large infrastructure projects. And of course, consent has a whole major role to play in the idea of liberal democracy, which, as I understand it, a lot of Americans don't support anymore, but I think most of us still do. Hope that continues. So what do we mean by consent? Well, we wrote an article, it's published, I guess, 2 years ago now, in November of 2020, unpacking this. This was pretty much the work that we did with the Department of Energy back in 2016 and 17. Basically 4 parts: autonomy, that whoever's giving consent has to be an autonomous person, which means they know what's in their best interests. Voluntariness means there's no coercion of any type. And that can get complicated. There's something called situational coercion, which is very more subtle than having somebody actually twist your arm or pass a piece of legislation. Full understanding, and okay, you got to understand all the risks and benefits. Okay, what does that mean? And it has to be prior. So you have to have consent before you actually act on whatever project you want to do. So we unpack all that stuff in that paper, which I'm happy to share with people if they want it. And I know here tonight, I know DOE is mainly interested in CIS, consolidated interim storage, because that's what Congress has given them money to do. And they can only do what Congress tells them to do. I get that. But, you know, the BRC, as somebody pointed out earlier, focused on deep geological repository. And that's kind of like what, you know, that's what Canada's working on, and obviously Finland and Sweden, and you know all this, Japan and England, and lots of countries, Switzerland, France, have all been using some sort of consent-based process to look for a site for a deep geological repository. So in our work, here, we just asked about a deep geological repository. We didn't ask people specifically about a consent-based site for consolidated interim storage. Now, there's tons of challenges for how to do this. The whole bunch of these have come up already. We've outlined them in our reports and in our paper. And so what we wanted to do was to try to get a sense of, gee, how do smart people who have been thinking about this for quite a few years, how do they think about some of these key questions? What are their solutions to these things that you see up on the screen there? And so what we did was we selected some people that we knew have been deeply involved in this, and include community activists, included people from the industry, from the federal government, from state and tribal governments, and universities, consultant think tanks. And we wanted to understand how they think about consent and their ideas about how to design and run a consent-based siting process for the permanent disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level waste. Well, that's what we were doing. So we talked to a bunch of people, and we do this. I'm not going to get into the methods here, but it's called Q methodology. It's a way of revealing intersubjective beliefs. It's got a long history in social psychological research, and we've used it numerous times in the past. We've written a guide primer on how to do it. We've had graduate students do their thesis on using this method. So it's something we've used a lot and we know a lot. And basically the way it works is we ask a small group of people to express their views about a topic. And then we look for commonalities across people and through their narratives in order to identify what we call intersubjective perspectives or perspectives. Sometimes these are called social narratives because their bits and pieces are shared among different people. And the way we do this is by having people sort statements according to a agree, kind of more agree, less agree hierarchy. And then we do a kind of statistical analysis on this called inverted factor analysis, but we don't need to get into that tonight. So what comes out of all this analysis are 4 different narratives about how people think a consent-based process should be designed and run for permanent disposal, finding at least one permanent disposal site for spent nuclear fuel. And we give these perspectives names. And so these are the names you see here. And I'll just say a few words about each one of these. And then I'll talk about some of the commonalities and differences. And we also do a correlation coefficient so we can tell how each individual's personal story relates to this story. So I can identify a few of our participants in the study who agree with this perspective 80 or 90%. And then I can show you others that agree with this perspective about 5 or 6%. So you can see that some people are going to associate with one's perspective more than another. So this perspective is really focused on making a safety case and doing good science, having sound technical criteria for the site, and doing both interim and permanent disposal at the same time. And we associate this with expediency. These people seem to want to solve this problem quickly so we can move on to advanced reactors. So that's one of the reasons to do these things in parallel, not to wait till we have a permanent disposal site before we search for interim sites. Because they said that would delay it another 15 years, and we can't, climate change won't let us wait that long for advanced nuclear, according to these individuals. We asked a question, one of the questions has to do with when can the community reverse consent? What if, because we imagine, I think, Natalia said something about it, or somebody said a stepped or phased process like Canada has. We anticipate, I think most people anticipate there will be multiple periods when you need to elicit consent, or a community would have to consent or say no. But at some point, when could they get out of the process? What are the off ramps? Should there be limits on that? And this perspective says, yes, there should be limits. You can't just let a community get out at any time. We have to restrict them into their agreement at one point. Of course, it's important to understand risk and benefits, and you have to have dialogue with all the community, but focus on quality, not quantity. Don't worry about how many people are coming to the meetings, but what's being said at those. So that's perspective A. Perspective B is they focused on trust. They're like, you have to get trustworthiness. DOE has to earn trust. And you do that by having independent oversight of this process, even if it's Oh, let me just say, back up a second. We also asked people kind of a separate little survey, who should run this? Should it be DOE or public-private partnership or some nonprofit or another federal agency outside DOE? And we got every single answer. I think every alternative was ranked 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there was, we just talked generally about the organizing entity, whoever is put in charge of this. We just used that vague name. So this perspective thought it was important to have independent oversight of the process, no matter who is running it. They had to demonstrate listening, because that's how you get trust. They had to give the community power, that is to oversee the operations of the facility once it's finished, like they can at WIP. And they had to have the community design the process and decide how they want to issue consent. Now, I know Dr. Petrie mentioned that in an answer to a question. And to that, I just would like to raise one point, is that, you know, myself, I and a whole bunch of other people have been thinking about this for a long time. It's a really complicated process. So if we are not only asking the community to learn about nuclear waste, spent nuclear fuel, geology, risks, benefits, transportation risks, economics of a facility, but now we also want them to learn about consent, trust, consent-based processes, and have them design their own processes. I really see that as setting a really, really high bar. Just personally, my own opinion from this, I thought Chris Campany's point about performance metrics was really great. Like, yeah, you can design your own process, but it has to achieve performance on these indicators. How you measure those things is another challenge. But anyway, back to the report here, this perspective says the community should design their process. Perspective C was about inclusion and transparency. So their first thing was you got to give communities money so they can hire their own experts. They can come to their own understandings. This is all about like making sure they understand what they're getting into. So you have to disclose information, you have to translate it if you need to make it available. You want to maximize the number of people, and you want to have a referendum, because that's going to be the best thing, according to this perspective, to ensure the community's really consenting, really going hardcore for participatory democracy here. Make sure the project doesn't add to injustices, and don't worry about trust. It's really about sharing power. Forget about building trust. If you focus on building trust, according to this perspective, you're doing the wrong thing, because you'll get trust if you share power and treat people correctly. And the last perspective is D here, is developing legitimacy. And these people believe you need to show you're listening to the public. You need to give the public, again, influence over the process in terms of setting the safety standards, the performance standards for site approval and licensing. And again, giving the community the decision to how it wants to issue consent. And I know that Canada's Nuclear Waste Management Organization does this, and they have 2 sites in Northern Ontario right now that are choosing 2 very different paths to do this. Giving the community oversight power once again, giving them that power. And again, on this issue of a timetable, this group says, don't worry about the timetable. Member perspective A was, we have to stick to the timetable because we have to get this done now because of climate change and we need the advanced nuclear. This group says, don't worry about the timetable, kind of more like the Canadian approach, right? Take the time to do it right. And you don't need an independent board to oversee this, because NRC does a great job overseeing these things, and we should trust them, according to this perspective. So we saw a lot of agreement. We saw really, really strong support for funding to communities and tribes so they can hire their own experts. We saw really, really strong support for tribes being able to make decisions with the federal government that do not need state approval. In other words, tribes are sovereign nations. They're fully autonomous and they shouldn't be subjected to state. Whereas communities, non-tribal communities would need state approval. Most parties agreed to that. That communities have to be able to negotiate for benefits that make them better off. So don't try to write the benefits into the law and make them all exactly the same, but give communities that power and authority to negotiate for themselves. But now you have the problem that people recognize that some benefits can be coercive. So how do you prevent a community from negotiating for benefits that coerce their autonomy? See, this is really a challenge. It may be necessary, this is agreement, that it might be necessary to violate prior promises and previous agreements that the government had had. And people would argue that, hey, times have changed, we've learned, we've promised things in the past that maybe aren't smart to keep promising anymore. We had a lot about congressional influence over this. Everybody wanted Congress out of the picture, pretty much, except for a couple of people who argued that they believe in democracy and that Congress is the top of, the chief legislative body in the country. So we shouldn't remove Congress. And other people said, well, there's no way to get Congress out of it anyway, unless you amend the Constitution, and that's not going to happen. So everyone wants Congress. A lot of people wanted Congress not to get involved. As for transportation communities, what to do with them or adjacent communities, most people agreed they should be involved, but they shouldn't have a veto. So what does that mean? We don't know. And key thing is to focus on economically disadvantaged and future generations. And how we do that, again, is another challenge. This is, I think, my last slide. Some of the things I'll leave you with, should we focus on past untrustworthy behavior of the DOE or just move on? It's one way to move on is to remove this from the DOE's purview, or just move on because that would be the only game in town. That's another possibility. How does a community issue consent? Do voters have to get involved or can elected officials do it? And back to that original discussion about, gee, are we going to let communities come up with their own idea of a consent-based process? Well, who's going to design that? What process are they going to use to design the process? You get into this, and who's going to oversee the performance of that process to make sure the process to design the consent-based process isn't co-opted by certain powerful interests in the community, which again, I think speaks to this need for some sort of performance metrics and outside evaluation. Number 3 here, how to have consistency when elections change. Many people pointed to the frustration of the flip-flopping between the Democratic and Republican parties, and how that is so unhelpful when it comes to trying to solve a long-term problem. Thus, we get to the challenge of strict versus a flexible timetable. The reset report recommended a pretty strict timetable. Of course, the Canadians have a more flexible one. And some people pointed to the absolute sort of unsuccessfulness or wrongness of trying to legislate a timetable. So hopefully Congress doesn't try to do that again, because I think everybody was opposed to that. If a community does give consent, can it take it back? And if so, under what conditions and how far into the process? At some point, you've got to figure that the federal government's invested X billion dollars, and they shouldn't be expected to just throw that money away. But when and under what conditions? What if certain agreements are broken? Then can the whole thing be jettisoned even after spending 20, 30 billion? And then, of course, this challenge that we face here tonight, or right now, March 4th, do the full system or piecemeal? So that's all I have for you tonight. Thanks for listening. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. And we'll be sending comments to the DOEs for this RFI, and we'll also be having our report. I was hoping to have the report ready tonight, but it's not ready. Seth is in Israel with students, so he couldn't get it done, but we plan to do it in the next couple of weeks. And if the panel's interested in the report, we'll be happy to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Webler. And so now we'll move into a question and answer period, or if there are any other comments, same as before, you can go ahead and raise your hand right here. You can do that through the reactions button. And before we do, Dr. Webler, I know that you've had a family emergency come up this evening. So are you able to join us at least for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Briefly,
I still haven't heard about Mom.
I'm sorry?
I'm still waiting to hear about Mom, so no problem.
Okay.
I can't go to the hospital anyway, so.
I appreciate your time. So any questions for Dr. Webler before we move into the panel discussion of the advisory opinion? Yes, Deb Katz.
Well, Tom, this seems so confounding. I mean, it's like a morass, what you described, in terms of trying to even get to the beginning of yes in this, which is so daunting. I mean, which is why I always think that geography rules the day, in a sense, until you have sound science finding sites, whether they're interim sites or permanent sites. You can't do any of the rest. It's sort of like I experience this whole process as ass backwards. So you want people to trust a process you haven't developed, which is insane. Who in their right mind will buy a car without looking under the hood? I mean, you look at the car. I mean, I guess some people are buying it on some site on the web now, but you know, that's what you do. So that what you're describing is there are ways in which people have similar notions, but the basic hard notion of how you deal with this seems so disparate in terms of where people are. And it sort of bespeaks a state in which there is no trust whatsoever by anyone. And that's because of the failure of the government and the industry to actually be responsible. And so you're starting from a position in some ways of a kind of paranoia everyone is operating at, that they have to get past without feeling they're being duped. I mean, it's so tragically complicated, and yet it has to get dealt with. And in a certain way, that's why I always go back to science as the first step. If you create a sound process that science lays out the conditions of what can happen and how, then you can see who will listen to that and deal then with the complexities, because the complexities are not going to go away in any of this. But at least you will have some basis to talk about. And until then, this is just sort of abstract. And the danger is always when things are abstract that anything is possible. And look at where we are in the world, living in an abstract world. You know, it hasn't worked. So I don't know if you have any response. That you and I have talked a lot. So, I mean, we know each other and have done things together. So it's.
You're right, Deb. It's complex, you know, but there was a lot of agreement among people. So we have some place to start. Canada has had a process going for, gee, I don't even know how long now. But, you know, I think we have to, you know, Canada had the benefit of the Seaborn panel, which I think, you know, I've argued before was a good thing to do, to get some sort of national consensus on the fact that we should put this stuff in a deep geological repository, which we haven't done in this country, although other countries have done that. but we have some agreement. I think we could identify good principles, understanding, transparency, voluntariness, and then a lot of hashing out needs to happen. The problem is, and I'm always happy to tell this to everyone at the DOE does not really have a lot of social science capacity. So they don't, for all respect for engineers, and I'm an electrical and biomedical engineer who became a social theorist of risk, okay? So I respect engineers, I respect the science, but we definitely need the science, but we need social scientists to help figure out these challenges. But it's not something this country values or respects like in Europe. So we don't make progress because the problems are not engineering problems. The problems are political and social, and yet we keep throwing more money at engineers.
Agreed. I agree. But it's still confounding. Even if we got all the social scientists, working on this, it's
sure. There's more than
daunting.
One solution. Right?
And what is never said in this is we've made the most dangerous and toxic waste that will be deadly and has to be isolated from the environment for 1 million years. I mean, that's not what we say when we talk about it. And yet that's the reality that we have to deal with in this. Mm-hmm. And how can we do that responsibly, ethically, and justly? And it hasn't worked so far. Let's put it that way. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good.
Thanks, Deb.
Yes, Sarah Coffey, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Wibler, for this. This is actually really helpful as a backdrop. I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I thought that you around the points of interest of agreement, and just that it's really helpful to have this as we move into looking at this draft letter that our subcommittee has been working on, and as you can imagine, is this work, all of this touches on this really challenging work and the situation that we're in now. But I just want to say thank you for joining us this evening and appreciate your work.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Which is a great segue, and I don't see any other hands raised. So unless there are other questions or comments for Dr. Wibler and his presentation, I think then we can move along to a panel discussion of the advisory opinion itself. So I don't see any other hands. So panel, I think that we're going to take up the discussion. Dr. Wibler, thank you for joining us. You are, of course, very welcome to stay, but I know that things come up. So if you can, it would be great to hear your thoughts, but no pressure if you need to leave. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, panel. So I trust that you all had an opportunity to review the language of the draft opinion that was sent out last week. I won't rehash the process because I think we have, this panel has discussed it the last full, or the previous time before last, the panel meeting in December. And so we're prepared to discuss it. I'm tempted to turn it over to Lissa. Lissa, would that be okay? Would you like to, do you have any introductory remarks on behalf of the committee? Otherwise, unless there are other panel questions or comments or thoughts on the advisory opinion itself. How does that sound, Lissa?
It's just unmuting. Yeah, very briefly, and in interests of time, I just wanted to thank the other members of the committee, Maddie, and everybody else, Marvin and Corey and Tony. I think we entered into this process with a tall order here, was to find some consensus, and we all entered in with some with open minds, I believe. And I think throughout the year we've learned a lot, and really that was the intention all along of the committee, is to try to just inform and educate ourselves. And I think all of us have learned something or other along the way. So the draft language represents basically the best we could do with the time that we had and our level of attention. We spent a couple of hours trying to hash things out together. The request for information was very far ranging. It wasn't very well focused. The way it was organized, frankly, didn't raise a lot of trust or faith in the process, in me personally, speaking personally, because it was so wide ranging. And after all, this process isn't something new. It is something that the Department of Energy has been engaging in for quite some time. So while it might be part of the perfection process, I think there's been ample time to try to find ways forward. So it's rather, it was difficult to find language, and we focused on areas where we could find consensus, which, as we've seen from the previous presentation, is really difficult to achieve. So I'm really proud of our committee. We plan to keep learning in the year ahead. We did feel that NDCAP should participate with some input to this federal process at this point, since DOE is asking. So I'm curious what other panel members think, and I hope we can approve this advisory language tonight so that we can have some input in this process. So thank you, especially to committee members, for your time in trying to put this together. I would just move forward to see if there was any comments, and I would make a motion to approve the language.
I think just to honor the agenda, we'll stick to having a panel discussion and open it up to see if there are any public comments on the language, and then open it up for a vote.
Okay, great.
So panelists, any discussion?
I'm ready to vote.
Perhaps it sounds like we're ready to vote. So then
we need to take public comments.
We'll take public comments first. So any members of the public like to comment on the advisory opinion? It's an efficient group tonight.
Wow.
Okay.
Emily?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Tony. I just, I did not, I completely forgot to do this, but we did get a couple of written comments from Ann Darling, and I know Ann was here before. I'm not seeing her. Oh, she is still here. I don't know if she wanted these comments read into the record. It's just too, well, I hesitate to call them editorial items.
I think that's, I will defer to the source and say, Anne?
Well, I believe I sent it to the entire panel.
Yes.
Right?
No, you actually just sent it to the committee. Okay, I see. Yeah, you sent it to the PSD NDCAP email address, which is really not everyone and not all panelists have signed up to receive email from that panel, from that email address. So it is panel leadership has seen it. I believe Lissa has seen it, but I'm not sure everyone on the panel has seen this right now.
Yeah.
Can we read it into public comments or put them in before we do that? Tony, is that possible, or do we have them in front of us?
Well, I can certainly read them if Anne doesn't have them, because I have a printout of what she sent. But
I have them, but I'd have to go.
Okay,
Tony
well,
has them and can read them, Anne.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then bear with me. They're both short. The first item is Vermont NDCAP recommends that development of a consolidated interim storage facility should remain directly coupled to establishing a permanent repository as required under the new Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This statement says that a permanent repository should be sited before or in tandem with any interim storage facilities. Okay, and your point here is that you agreed with that.
Yeah, these are actually two related things.
Okay.
One is the kind of the background, and the second one is
Okay. Okay. So the second item is further asking a community to consent to act as an interim site in the absence of any progress towards a permanent site will continue to undermine confidence in the DOE consent-based siting process. I believe that this is another line in the proposed advisory opinion.
That's a quote.
The statement does not say why the absence of progress toward a permanent site will undermine confidence in the DOE process. And you indicated you think this is too vague. I don't know. I believe those are your two comments. Now there's a subsequent paragraph. Do you want me to continue with that? Okay.
Yeah.
And says, I think it is really important to be more explicit about the fact that local communities cannot give informed consent to an interim storage facility unless they know how long the high level waste will be at the interim storage site. This would require that at a minimum, a permanent repository or repositories is cited, a stable source of adequate funding is available to pay for building and managing it, and the timeline for this development is transparent, reasonable, and developed with public input. And you note in parentheses, I'm thinking here of all of the examples of nuclear facilities that have taken much longer and cost more money than the public was told. And you conclude with the idea of consent-based siting for interim storage without this coupling shouldn't even be on the table. I think it needs to be explicit instead of implied as it is in the draft.
That's what I said.
Yeah. Thank you for those comments.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you.
I wonder what the panel feels about amending to reflect the comments that were made about that line, that it's difficult for any community to agree to be an interim site without any process on a permanent site. There was a line that you had suggested, and that said that, without a time frame, you further illuminated that. And I would say that might be a sentence that we could probably all agree on, that without a real timetable and a sense of what's to come, in terms of that timing, how long a facility might be interim, might be a line that the panel could consider adding as an amendment before voting. And I'm wondering if there's any commentary on that, and if Tony could read that line once more. And I would suggest, if we were going to do it, to add it after that, further asking a community to consent to act as an interim site in the absence of any progress toward permanent site.
Lisa, can you just point us to exactly where you're reading in the text, because that would help us all follow you?
Yeah, it's right 5 graphs up from the end before that's last question in bold. It begins with further. I'm sorry, we should have had these numbered and would do so in the future. But further asking a community, that paragraph.
Yeah, hold
Tony,
on. Let me
read that one line that she had suggested, that suggested how could a community do that with no sense of how long it might be interim?
Okay, so I believe you're asking for the last sentence.
Yes.
Or the last 2 sentences. The idea of consent-based siting for interim storage without this coupling shouldn't even be on the table. I think that needs.
That wasn't. It was the one that said in the absence of a timeline. Right after the quote, right after she quoted that graph that we're all looking at right now, there was a line right now.
Yeah. Wait. I'm still trying to find it here.
She quoted the graph, further asking a community to consent.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Right. Okay. I was sorry. I was looking in the wrong paragraph.
I mean, we could consider it
okay.
all. I'm just moving to include that line. That
Okay.
right
So
after.
so the additional line would be, this statement does not say why the absence of progress toward a permanent site will undermine confidence in the DOE process. I believe that's the line you're asking about. Okay.
Keep going.
Okay. It is really important to be more explicit about the fact that local communities cannot give informed consent to an interim storage facility unless they know how long the high-level waste will be at the interim storage site.
Yes, that was what that line.
Okay.
Local communities cannot give consent if they do not know how long they're consenting for.
I'm just marking the highlight for myself so I know exactly what we're talking about. Okay.
I don't, I would recommend we could add that line that local communities cannot give consent if they don't know how long they are consenting for, if that line that Anne had suggested. There might be other panelists who feel that other parts of Anne's comments should be added, but I would certainly add that line. And I agree with Anne that we shouldn't be considering an interim site without that making progress on a permanent storage facility, but that's up to the rest of the panel if it wants to accept that language. I would.
I'm pulling up the email too. I'd like to have that language dropped into the chat so that panelists can sort of see it. Speaking for myself, sometimes it's hard to just hear it.
Yeah.
But then if we'll turn to Chris and then Sarah for additional thoughts, maybe on this amendment.
Yeah, I appreciate the offering. I'm inclined to leave it as it is. We already talk about in here, I really appreciate the work of the committee on this, that recommends development of consolidated interim storage facility to remain directly coupled to establishment of a permanent repository. So I think that base is covered. And I guess I'm okay with adding the language about about not knowing how long that a community can't consent in the absence of that knowledge. But actually, we don't know that. To Deb's point, I was just thinking, about nobody buys a car without looking under the hood. Actually, people do that all the time. Not that it's advised or a good idea, but it happens. But part of what I'm thinking is, I'm fine with whatever the whole panel wants to do. I just don't know if it's necessary, but whatever we want to do is fine.
Any other comments on that or the rest of the opinion? I would move to approve the language, including Anne's sentence, which I have written in the chat. Local communities cannot give consent without knowing how long the site may be, quote, interim. Or we could change it to might find it difficult, or, I think cannot is pretty. I would include that language. Do we want to vote on that or?
First, Sarah, you had your hand raised.
I took it down since there seems to be a.
Likely cannot.
So
I would accept likely cannot.
Okay, so there, Lisa, are you moving to amend the advisory opinion to include local communities likely cannot give informed consent to an interim storage facility unless they know how long the high level waste will be at the site? At that site. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm moving to approve the advisory language with that additional line supplied by the community.
Again, just so that we could stay a little bit true to the agenda and not get things, can this be a motion to amend the advisory opinion? And then I'd like to take public comment.
Okay.
Actually, that was our public comment period.
Yes.
I think that's fair to say, and we didn't have any. So, I'm going to retract what I just said. You're right. So, motion to amend and then approve the advisory opinion with this language.
Yes, I move.
Okay.
It's a two-part process, though, right? We're moving first to amend it and then to approve it.
Yes.
So, is there a second for the motion to amend the advisory opinion?
I thought Sarah was going to second. I'll second.
Thank you, Chris. Motion approved. And I think we'll do, just because it is an advisory opinion, we'll go through and do a roll call vote on this amendment to approve this additional language.
Could we have some discussion, Emily? I'm sorry, is it like, isn't
yes.
that the next step?
Yes,
So,
please.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to come in. I really appreciate the work that this group has done on this. This has been really tricky. And I don't feel particularly strongly about adding or not adding this language. I felt like it was pretty good as it was, because I didn't think that this was as substantive of a change. So, because I honestly prefer to have the document in front of us, like final to us, for us to approve it. And I really do want to get this in, because there's been a lot of work that's been done on this. And I want to make sure that we're really clear on what that language is. And so for me, I think that this document is really sufficient for that purpose. And so I would prefer not to amend it so that we can have a cleaner process, because we have stumbled in the past with that and therefore subsequently delayed it. So, and it's no disrespect to the public comments that Anne's provided or what Liz is saying. I'd prefer to, I thought this was very detailed and good as it.
I would move to then, based on Sarah's commentary, I would just move to revise my move to amend and just move to approve the advisory language as submitted. Unless anyone disagrees.
I will unsecond the motion.
Okay, so now we have an open motion to approve the advisory opinion as submitted.
Yes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Sarah. And discussion? Any additional panel discussion?
For what it's worth, Emily, I'd like to chime in briefly, and I appreciate also Ann Darling's comment and input. We worked very hard to make the language succinct, and I believe all the input that Anne was attempting to provide is implied with the message and the language that we developed for the opinion. So I'd like to think that we're still meeting the intent, including Anne's effort. And if you read the opinion carefully, I think we are still satisfying the same spirit of her energy and passion for what she would like us to include with the language that we did, and keeping it clean and short helps it be more of the elevator type speech that we hope the DOE takes with all the sincerity that we put into developing it. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Corey. I agree. Any other panel discussion? Otherwise, I think then we're ready for a vote. Okay, so we'll go through with a roll call vote. We're starting at the top. Madeline Arms.
Aye.
Todd Amato.
He's still there.
I hope he didn't run out after his first meeting.
Aye.
Thank you, Todd. Got it. Chris Campany.
Aye.
Representative Coffey.
Yes.
Patricia Coppolino, Trish, I thought I saw you enter the meeting later. Would you, if you're here?
Unmute.
Perhaps Trisha's not here. Okay, we will move along. Corey Daniels.
Stay.
Emily Davis, aye. Brett Long.
Do we lose Brett?
Brett.
We may have lost him. I'm not seeing him on the list right now, but.
Yes, I also don't see him on the list. Okay, we might have lost Brett. David Pearson.
Abstain.
Marvin Resnikoff.
Aye.
Jim Porter, as designee for Commissioner Tierney, it's not clear to me if you're able to vote on her behalf.
I'm not sure either. I would say that if I were to vote, since we've not had an opportunity to discuss this, I think I would have to abstain. So we can either not vote or abstain.
Okay, I'm going to mark you down as an abstention.
Okay.
And Lisa Weinman.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, panel, then it looks like that motion passes. So we have, this panel has just approved the advisory opinion as drafted and submitted. Thank you, panel. Good work on that. So the next steps and the original intent was that this will be submitted to the Department of Energy ahead of the March 4th meeting. That's correct, Lisa? Okay.
Yes.
And are you going to steward that process forward on behalf of the panel and then the committee too?
Yes, well, with Tony's help as always.
Yeah. What I'm anticipating is that I will submit the comments. The deadline is 5 p.m. Eastern time on Friday. So if, just for everyone's awareness, the advisory opinion specifically asks for the meeting recording, the link to the meeting recording be included in the advisory opinion. So I have already been assured by BCTV that we will have the final meeting recording available before Friday. So, or sometime on Friday at the latest. And once that occurs, I will submit this to the Department of Energy. I'll need to go to their consent-based citing website and see how specifically I submit it, but I assume it's fairly easy with with electronic submittal. So.
And I'll also just take this time to remind members of the public and also individual panelists that you can always submit comments as an individual. And I'm sure all of the instructions are on the DOE's website for that. So, okay.
Can I ask one question before we break, which is,
sure.
Is this the kind of thing that gets a press release from the Department of Public Service on? I mean, I don't know what has happened with previous advisory opinions, but is that something that would happen just because it's an official thing? Or Tony, do you know?
That's actually a very good question, because the last time that we issued an advisory opinion, it was during the Shumlin administration. So what was done in the previous administration does not necessarily reflect what would be done here. So I don't know, Jim, perhaps you and I will need to talk to the commissioner about this and get her opinion on it. My suggestion would be is that we will be posting the advisory opinion to the NDCAP website, and perhaps maybe the appropriate notification is to announce to the public that we've updated the NDCAP website to include this advisory opinion. But to my knowledge, the previous advisory opinions, we simply posted them, and that was it. We did make a note of them in the annual report as well, is what I'm recalling.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Yeah. Sarah.
I think if it would be with the input of the panel, I think it would be a good idea for us to put out a press release. And I have to say, I don't, with all due respect to Commissioner Tierney, I don't think that's necessarily her decision. I think it's a decision of this panel. So not to put you in a tight spot, Tony, but I think it would be a good idea. This is good work. It's something that the panel should feel we've supported it and feel good about it. And if the folks who had to abstain, maybe that can be made really clear, the abstentions. But I think it demonstrates to the public what we're doing and engages them in our work. So that would be, Emily, I don't know if you want to, how you want to handle this, but.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't really know. I'm not sure what the best way to handle this is. I think that this is new territory as far as I understand for the panel to have this kind of process around an advisory opinion and deliberative and intentional process. And I think that I agree with you. And I think I would imagine that other panelists would agree that this can be a good opportunity to engage the public and to share this good work, because the committee has done a lot of work over the year. Chris, you had your hand raised briefly. Did you want to add something?
No, I mean, I think it's this is an action that the panel is taking. Department of Public Service staffs this. Ultimately, yes, June provides direction to Tony, not trying to get Tony in a pickle, but Emily, if you need help, if it's got to be released from you, I'm happy to help if you need help drafting a press release. If there's an issue here, I don't know if Jim wants to weigh in. Hey Jim, how you doing?
Hey Chris, how are you?
Good.
I don't imagine that there would be any issue with that. I mean, we're basically a pass through, and it's an NDCAP statement. So I think we're fine with the department, issuing the press release. I think that's fine.
Thank you, sir.
I think, that it is good for the public to know what NDCAP is doing, and also for our legislature to know.
Oh, sure.
We have some press here too, by the way, just FYI.
And when I say we, I'm saying Tony, because I think he's the one that typically does those.
Yeah, I usually wind up drafting the press releases for the most part and get a little input. Jim, I think there was one point, Jim, that you suggested something. I know Eric Guzman suggested some changes at one point, and it's mostly June's input or input from, if it's NDCAP, input from Emily. If it's the Waste Policy Committee, Lissa frequently provides me feedback. What I can add besides the press release, we can certainly put a notice on the NDCAP website to say, hey, we issued this advisory opinion in response to the DOE's request for information. Here it is. So regardless of the press release, we'll at least have that. But it's, I didn't want to commit to doing a press release without consulting departmental leadership on it. And Jim, let's plan on talking to June, but I'm of the mind that she'll probably okay this as well. So we'll have no objection.
Yeah, I'm certain she'll be fine with this.
Yeah, I think that posting it to the website, maybe at a minimum, it seems like there is some panel consensus around having a press release. Okay. Also, respectfully, I don't know, among my colleagues and peers, I don't think many frequent the NDCAP website, though I'll make sure that they bookmark that page. So I think maybe then in terms of process, I would be happy to draft a press release and then send it around to panelists and also the department. And if there are any edits to that, you can reply. I think it will not be official NDCAP business if you reply just to me and to get feedback from the panelists. Does that seem like that can be an informal process that works for? Oh, Chris, yes.
Kind of make life a little easier, maybe. Just trying. I think this could be sent out as a press advisory. I put some language in the chat. Just as meeting on February 28, 2022, the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning adopted the following advisory position, which should probably continue to say. In response to the Department of Energy, and just leave it, have that one sentence, and then there's the thing, right?
Yeah.
We don't need quotes like, this is a momentous occasion for the nuclear decommissioning.
No. Right.
So.
I like that suggestion, Chris.
Yes.
Panelists, do you all agree with this?
Absolutely. I do.
With this process?
I do.
Chris, as usual, another good idea.
Yeah, always good ideas from the captain of the ship over there. You look like you're on the high seas with that flag behind you.
Does anyone have any concerns about this process? We'll put it that way. Sending out a press advisory. No. Okay.
I just also wanted to say that I have been chairing the Federal Nuclear Waste Policy Committee for the past year, but if I'm very, very open and willing for other leadership, if there's anyone else who would like to become the chair of that committee, I just wanted to put, maybe that should be something that we look at next full NDCAP, because I know there's term limits to such things and it's good to get fresh thinking and new blood. So I just want to put out there that, if anybody would like to step into that role, I'm more than happy to continue participating, but step aside.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, at this point, panel, unless there's any other discussion on this, then we'll turn to general public comments for this special NDCAP meeting.
They've all taken off.
And without seeing others, then we'll enter into meeting wrap up and adjourn. And I would entertain. So before we break, our next meeting is an regularly scheduled meeting where we assume our typical panel business of receiving state reports and the North Star report, and that will be in. I
believe the date is May 9th. Bear with me for a second. I can confirm that.
That sounds right.
Because I got to get this up on the website too, and I just haven't figured out how to cleanly do that.
I think it is Monday, May 9th.
Yeah, they're all Mondays.
Okay.
And also the Nuclear Waste Policy Committee will meet again, but I don't think I think we set a date. I'm not.
Yes, we did. Nuclear Waste Policy Committee. As a matter of fact, you and I need to discuss what we want to discuss at that meeting, but we're set for March 28th.
Okay.
I have found the NDCAP full panel meeting dates, and yes, the next one is May 9th, followed by September 19th and December 12th.
Okay, that's our lineup panel. Committee meeting on March 28th, another full NDCAP meeting on May 9th, and then again in September and then December per usual.
I think we have Skylar Gould raising his hand too. Did I see that? Or
yeah, yeah. Thank you. I just want. I'm very gratified by the common sense approach that Lisa has taken, and that the committee too. It's hard to get a group like this to agree on everything, and I think it's a strong statement. And I'm looking forward to the larger community to learn from this, and also to learn that this committee and the panel is an effective body and that it's working for the best interests of the state of Vermont. So thank you, and especially thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Skylar. And on that high note, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. This special meeting of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel is adjourned at 8:13 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially panelists for all your good work this evening. Thank you, Lissa, for stewarding the process and for presenting this draft language that was very easy for us to digest and to deliberate on.
Well, thanks to the other committee members for their great input. And thank you, Emily, for being very, very good leader. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much, all of our friends at the department. And I don't know if Dr. Webler is still here, but thank you, Dr. Webler, for joining too. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay.